This is a reading from the book titled Akita, The Tears and Message of Mary. Chapter 3. A Wound in the Hand. The day following the Feast of the Sacred Heart, which is now the Feast of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the bishop finished his stay of 1 week and was about to return to Niigata. He called Sister Agnes to his room and told her that she could prepare to take her vows. Not able to believe her good fortune, she asked for confirmation. She indeed received the same answer she had read on the bishop's lips. I was so happy to receive this authorization that I would have cried out with joy. For me, it was an unspeakable joy to be able to consecrate myself entirely to God in this official way. My emotion was such that I could hardly find the words to thank him. But since Thursday evening, another mysterious event had occurred. While praying in the chapel, Sister Agnes felt as though something pierced the palm of her hand. She was concerned because she had never before experienced such a pain. The following morning, this was prolonged during the Mass and redoubled in intensity during the adoration. When she left the chapel, she furtively spread her fingers, which she had held closed tight. There, in the center of her palm, were 2 red scratches in the form of a cross. What was that? She asked herself. She was deeply concerned, thinking it was perhaps a sign of the measure of her sinfulness. The wound was 2 centimeters wide and 3 centimeters long, and appeared very large in the center of her hand. The pain was intense, and the aspect of the wound was very different from what one is accustomed to see. This did not seem to have been caused with a blade. Even if she had held a small cross in her hand, there would have remained a light cross pressed into the skin. It was as though a cross had been engraved in the skin, of a color bordering on rose. It was not repulsive as other wounds, and it seemed to give off even a certain beauty. Now on Saturday, which would be the Feast of the Immaculate Heart, the pain persisted, but it didn't seem to get worse. Sister Agnes bore it in silence, despite the pain she experienced. Since the way she kept her hand closed drew the attention of the superioress, Sister Agnes timidly showed her her hand. What in the world could that mean? It is truly because of my sins. Examining it more closely, the superioress, amazed, could not help exclaiming, "What a strange color!" Then she chided her. "Why did you not show it to the bishop before he left?" Sister Agnes could find no other response than, "I was afraid." Indeed, why did she not show it to the bishop? Sister Agnes was asking herself the same question. "I was afraid," is how she described her instinctive reaction. And in her dialect, the word she used to express this fear is a word which means fear mixed with respect, rather than just plain fear. As we usually understand the word, she was filled with feeling of respect and fear which seemed to impose silence upon her, because she was confronted with a phenomenon which she could only attribute to a supernatural force. Further, it was so different from the preceding events that she esteemed it of secondary importance, because she alone was concerned. The fact is that she hesitated to make anything of it before others. Furthermore, she had suffered illnesses and trials from her youth. She was accustomed to bearing suffering without making anything of it, and it seemed best, as she later justified, to be silent. On the following Thursday, the 5th of July, while Sister Agnes was in adoration between 8:30 and 10 o'clock, the angel came again and recited the rosary with her. With the angel, the praise became more authentic, more fervent. In the evening, towards the middle of the 6 o'clock prayer, her left hand suddenly was pierced with a sharp pain. It was as though someone had thrust a pick into her palm. It was all she could do to keep herself from crying out. But the prayer was more important. With difficulty, she succeeded in continuing to the end. When she found herself alone and again in the chapel, Sister Agnes wanted to look at the wound, but the pain was so great that she could not open her hand. Once she had left the chapel, she finally succeeded in opening her hand. At the center of the 2 branches of the cross, there was now a hole from which blood flowed. The evening meal was ready, but she had no desire to eat. However, not to draw the attention of her companions, Sister Agnes forced herself to take some food. When the meal was over, she excused herself and went to her room. The wound continued to hurt. It seemed as though the hand was being torn and the blood flowed through the hole. Each time as she looked, Sister Agnes thought of the seriousness of her sins and tried to bear the pain, recalling the sufferings of Christ on the cross. In her effort to remain calm, she tried to divert her attention by taking up her work, a crocheted handbag with little colored decorations. Pressing the crochet needle between the fingers of her left hand, stretched out with great pain, she began to work with an invocation at each movement of the needle. As a prayer, she could only repeat, "Lord, have pity. Forgive my offenses." How much time passed in this way? Suddenly, she jumped because the superioress tapped her on the shoulder. Sister Agnes was surprised because she thought the superioress had left with another sister and was not going to return to the convent until the next day. Account of the superioress. Footnote: Father Yasuda refers to this superioress as Sister K and refers to any other sisters in the community only by the first initial of their last name. Sister K was not always the superioress throughout these events, but we continue to refer to her by this title as a means of identification. That evening we had been invited to eat at a house in town, and we were to spend the night in one of our convents there. But I was preoccupied by the condition of Sister Agnes, so I decided to return to the convent. I went directly to her room, where I found her seated on her bed, crocheting. At my request, she opened her hand with great difficulty and said to me with tears in her eyes, "It hurts me so that I took out my work." She seemed in agony. "If I have come to this, it is perhaps that my sins are grave?" As for myself, I felt that this must have been sent to her by the Lord. "It seems to hurt you very much, but try to bear it by thinking of the sufferings of the Lord. Excuse us for all causing you to bear the consequences of the sins of us all." I tried to console her as best I could, and I went to look for one of the other sisters. The two of us treated the wound with gauze and bandaged the hand, and asked her to awaken us if the pain increased. When we retired, the trial of deafness, source of light. How did Sister Agnes pass that long night? She tells us, "When my two companions had left my room, wishing me good night, it was just 9 o'clock, the time when the community retires. Preparing myself as best I could for the night, I stretched out, but the pain was such that I was incapable of closing my eyes. I knelt down, resting upon my heels, squeezing the rosary between my fingers. I begged the help of the Blessed Virgin and prayed as much as I could for the pardon of my sins. It came to change the bandage because the wound was bleeding abundantly, and at certain moments the pain doubled in intensity. I noticed something curious. The blood stopped some moments when I was drying it, which does not happen with ordinary wounds. But each time I tried to stretch out to sleep a little, the pain caused me to jump, and I was obliged to remain seated to pray. Several times I tried in vain to sleep, when softly a thought took form within my heart, like a ray of light piercing through the darkness. "What is the matter with you, that you are so troubled?" How could God send trials without meaning? I had learned in the course of the circumstances of my life that it is exactly at the time that one thinks one is doing well, filled with graces, which come to be taken for granted, that a change comes like a cold shower to take us by surprise. The tasks which proceed well and make us proud, especially those which begin to preoccupy us, are taken away one day or the other. Likewise, when my ears suddenly became deaf in the church of Miyoko, was not everything going splendidly? Was I not fulfilled by my new activities? And if it was not the height of success, was I not satisfied by the thought of a future which seemed brilliant? Certainly, when I had taken up my position as guardian at the church, I was disturbed by what awaited me. I had just left the hospital without any experience of society, nor any particular preparation for being a catechist. Happily, the cooperation of those around me made my task easy. After having had my mother at my side for 2 weeks, she had hastened to the side of her daughter, who didn't even know how to cook rice because she had been hospitalized a good part of her life. Some attentive women of the parish brought me 3 meals each day for a month. The hospital was only 3 minutes away on foot, and I went each day to take my baths, and I was received like a member of the family. Sick persons called me to their bedside, one after the other, to hear about the good God, and had themselves baptized, to the joy of the doctors and the nurses. Even when I was alone at the church, I had nothing difficult to do. My purpose was to pray and be a humble servant of Mary, and to live in the service of God and of the neighbor. One day when I was praying thus in the church, someone knocked at the door. "I would like to hear you speak of God." Struck with joy at the sight of my first aspirant, I hastened to have her come in, and the word spread from person to person, mouth to mouth, and soon I found myself regularly with 7 or 8 persons during my hours of catechetical instruction. Only by the action of the Holy Spirit was I able to respond and attend to these persons seeking God, while I had no theological knowledge, guiding myself simply by the aid of a precise Catholic doctrine. I told them, it is not theory that counts, it is the joy of believing that I would like to communicate to you. If I would be able, I would open wide the doors of my heart so that one would understand with an overwhelming joy, far surpassing the sentences of a book. Was prayer for my brethren stronger than persuasion? In any event, 70 persons received baptism from the time I had arrived at this church. Although I was well aware that I was not the cause of these graces, a feeling of satisfaction had taken hold of me. I felt myself more and more attached to my work. Was it not exactly because of that the shock of deafness struck me? When I found myself suddenly plunged into the void of silence, lost in a stupor in the middle of the church with the rosary squeezed in my fingers, I felt forming within me the words of Job, crying from the depths of his misery, "The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And was not this my case? Ashamed of my failing faith and my lack of confidence, I began to shed warm tears. And after having wept a considerable time, an interior calm came over me, as though my fate had finally touched bottom. Since such was his will, what did it matter if I understood it or didn't understand? Should I not offer in praise all that he asked of me? Enlightened by this powerful reflection, I felt an enthusiasm which caused me to understand, if I dare say so, what a martyr might experience. From that moment, nothing more would be able to trouble me. If my neighbors would pity me in tears, I was at least able to keep my serenity. I can never forget the day when I had to say goodbye to the church in Miyoko. After the last visits of friends and acquaintances, I went back for a last time, not without emotion, to look at the church which I would not see again. Large flakes of snow fell in silence, and after a moment soon wiped out the traces of my footsteps. Truly, my task at Miyoko was over. Certainly I would be able to pray for the people I had known, but I must not look back on any success as my own. I was quite aware that even the trace of my footsteps must disappear. And now it was the same. I had become accustomed to the life in the convent on the hill, and I had begun to hold my place in this little community. The Lord sent me a new trial. It was not so much the work that he willed from me. It seemed rather he invited me to contemplate him in order to progress into a more intimate union. I knew very well that it all depends on his will. I had felt the effects of his grace, which had permitted me to bear sufferings through my entire life. Therefore, why should I permit myself to be troubled? These thoughts, which followed silently into my soul, soon overcame my anguish. As a despairing person who has finally found a pillar to which to cling, it became much easier to bear the intense pain that continued to afflict my hand. As we can see from the above reflections of Sister Agnes, it is clear that this event has a profound meaning in her spiritual development. At the same time, it is a part of that long development for the moment chosen by Mary to communicate important messages to the world. The long struggle with suffering, the apparition of an angel in the form of a woman, the sudden loss of hearing, the mysterious light, the vision of the cohort of angels, the renewed apparition of the same heavenly person 4 years later, who seems to be her guardian angel. All these surprising events have a coherent sequence and a profound meaning. As everyone knows, the history of mystics in the Catholic Church offers numerous examples of saints who have received the stigmata, which are painful wounds of the Passion of Christ. Francis of Assisi and Catherine of Siena are among the more famous examples. Sometimes it also happens that persons who do not especially merit to be called saints receive the wounds of the cross. The Church looks upon such phenomena with prudence and guards against hasty veneration of signs too rapidly attributed to divine grace. In our time, such signs are considered more often as symptoms of mental disorders, such as hysteria. They are usually looked upon with doubt, if not with disdain. Nevertheless, we must discern, and one of the criteria of discernment of hysterical persons marked by this kind of wound is that they take a particular delight in showing it. It is as if they had received a special distinction from Christ in person, and they would like all the world to know it. The attitude of Sister Agnes is at all points opposed to what we have just said. From the moment she had this mysterious wound engraved in her hand, she thought only of her own sins, and she applied herself humble and confused, to hide the wound from those around her. I dared to ask her later if she had not thought of the word stigmata. Her response was simple: never in the world. I indeed had heard of stigmata, but are not such holy wounds reserved for the great saints like St. Francis of Assisi, who received them in the state of ecstasy during an apparition of Christ? How could I ever have thought for a second of so great a favor? For her part, the sister who found her in the room intuitively felt that the wound had been sent by the Lord. She felt compelled to console and to comfort Sister Agnes, who was ceaselessly lamenting her state of sinfulness. In the case of hysteria, it seems that the more painful the wound, the more it is accompanied by a feeling of delight and a tendency to brag about it. The subject needs to feel recognized because of vanity. There is nothing like this in the case of Sister Agnes. From the moment that she is aware of the phenomenon, the idea of her sins being the cause fills her with confusion. And when one asked her to which sins she referred, it was a question only of very ordinary weaknesses, which are the sign of a delicate conscience, such as lack of faith, insufficient gratitude, and so on. It goes without saying that this kind of extraordinary experience requires a great deal of prudence before concluding that it is of heavenly origin. One cannot see the hand of God in just every extraordinary fact. Nevertheless, it is likewise wrong to jump to the conclusion that such an extraordinary event is the result of hysteria. When one considers the road followed by Sister Agnes, her entire life, and her spirituality, it becomes clear that this wound was a divine intervention like the other phenomena which preceded it, and as we shall see, it was to have a special meaning in the entire sequence of events leading up to a great message for the world. It seems that Sister Agnes was being purified in the crucible of a sequence of trials in order to be more attentive and more open for the communication the Mother of God was to make to the world through her. As one can begin to understand the importance of those messages in the light of the painful and extraordinary preparations which preceded them. And a picture is included. I'll read the caption first. Above, Father John Engler, chaplain of the first organized pilgrimage to Akita from the U.S., returns after making active consecration before the weeping Madonna. Who can fail to be moved, he asks, by our mother's tears? The statue of Our Lady of Fatima is the international pilgrim virgin which also shed tears. It was taken to Akita by the American group of the World Apostolate of Fatima, led by Father Engler.